I would like to start by showing you three quotations which have, I think, a lot in common. The first, introducing the language of the conqueror, seems to be an obvious means of assimilating the conquered people to them. Second, it's always been the policy of the legislature to promote the use of English here, because this is a conquered country. And thirdly, the moral power of the schoolmaster is a more economical and effectual instrument for governing this people than the bayonet. Now, all these quotations see education as the means by which a governing power can establish and maintain its control over a nation it's conquered. And they all argue that teaching the conquered nation the language of the conqueror, which in one case is specified in English, is both the right of the governing power. This seems to be the assumption of quotation B. And also in quotation C, it's the cheapest and most efficient means of achieving the object of assimilating the conquered people to the governing power, as expressed in quotation A, and thus avoiding the need for the use of force. Education is better than the bayonet, in the words of quotation C. And my purpose in presenting you with these quotations is to draw attention to the attitudes which prompted them, that the teaching of the conqueror's language, English, to the subordinate peoples would also teach them attitudes sympathetic to the governing power, and therefore reduce the likelihood of a rebellion, which could only be ended by the use of armed force. And these are the sources of the quotations. And as you see, the first relates to India, the second and third relate to Wales. And while I don't want to push the parallels too far, I want to suggest that the underlying attitudes of the English authorities in both cases, India and Wales, and the policies which were shaped by those attitudes have a great deal in common. The English authorities in India were always aware that their numbers were completely inadequate to rule the country entirely by force. Macaulay's Minute of 1835 refers to the millions whom we govern in exactly that context. And Shashi Thakur makes the point that the British in India were never more than 0.05% of the total population. And so quotation C expresses the same sort of attitude with remarkable bluntness in relation to Wales. And the speech from which quotation 3 comes, a speech by William Williams MP in the House of Commons in 1846, makes it clear that education was seen as the alternative to use of force for a very specific reason. The previous 40 years had seen many incidents of civil unrest in Wales. There'd been revolts over rising food prices, demonstrations against wage cuts, and strikes in crucial industries in South Wales, the ironworks particularly. And even worse from the point of view of the authorities, in the previous 15 years, there'd been major insurrections in Wales, some of them also in the industrial south, in Merthyr Tydfil in 1831 and in Newport in 1839. In Merthyr, the centre of the town had been held for 4 days against the army and the militia. The Newport Rising of 1839 had been in many ways even more alarming to the authorities, since it was in support of explicitly political aims, that is, the parliamentary and political reforms demanded by the Chartists. It had been organised efficiently and in secrecy, and local magistrates had been unable to build up a network of informers. A London newspaper attributed this failure to the language barrier. In no part of the country could an organisation be formed with so little interruption as in a district where the lower orders speak almost universally a language unknown to the educated classes. And to the English authorities, something clearly had to be done to counter this disaffection in Wales, and done fast. What they required of the working class education, was that it should teach people to know and accept the place in society which had been assigned to them by those with more education and more power. And a vicar in Swansea told an inquiry into children's employment in the mines in 1842, "I am of the opinion, grounded in 60 years' experience, that the better the rising generation is educated in the principles of the Anglican Church, to fear God and honour the King, the safer the throne and the more glory to God." And reform of working class education in Wales was therefore essential. But before the reforms could be planned, it was necessary to have an accurate picture of the current situation. And William Williams's speech in the House of Commons called for an inquiry into working class education, which would give the authorities this accurate picture. And his reference to the possible need to use the bayonet was a not so subtle reminder of the dangers to law and order of doing nothing. The result was an inquiry for which Wales was divided into 3 parts, like Gaul under Julius Caesar, and a commissioner was appointed to lead the inquiry in each part. The 3 commissioners were all men, all English, all Anglicans, and all members of the upper middle classes. And the fact they knew nothing about Wales, education in Wales, Welsh society, history, language, or literature was seen as proof of their objectivity. They were barristers, and therefore it was assumed ideally equipped to elicit the objective truth from witnesses. And there are parallels here with the attitude of James Mill in his History of India in 1817. He regarded the fact that he'd never been to India and was completely ignorant of Indian languages as an advantage in writing, I quote, "an impartial and true history of the country." A similar attitude to claim to impartiality gave the conclusions of the commissioners investigating Welsh education a particular force. If they had just concluded that, with a few shining exceptions, Welsh schools and teachers were inadequate, that would have been one thing. Many Welsh people were fully aware of these shortcomings, and they cooperated with the inquiry in the hope that the government would provide the means to remedy them. But the commissioners' reports went on to conclude, in addition, that the Welsh people were typically liars, cheats, and thieves who neglected their personal hygiene and were sexually promiscuous. And further, the commissioners frequently related these negative attributes to religion and language, to the prevalence in Wales of religious nonconformity, and also to the prevalence of the Welsh language. And in the same way that Charles Grant argued that our religion, unquote, was the most important thing that would be brought to the people of India via our language, but again, so the commissioners regarded investigating the religious education of Welsh children as an important part of their remit. But this religious education had to be Anglican. The same attitude prevailed among British officials in India. Charles Grant, for example, described the Portuguese of India, and I'm quoting here, as a vicious and contemptible race. And he related this to the errors of the Roman Catholic persuasion. Non-Christians, of course, were led even further astray. And Macaulay's minute opines that Sanskrit and Arabic Arabic, inculcate, I'm quoting again, the most serious errors on the most important subject, which was religion. To the commissioners, the Anglican Church in Wales was a beacon of truth and propriety, while nonconformist sects were at least potentially politically suspect, as well as doctrinally unsound. Unfortunately, from the Commissioner's point of view, there were nearly 4 times as many nonconformists in Wales as there were Anglicans. The result, in the Commissioner's view, was that through their attendance in Welsh language chapels, Welsh school children were exposed to, these are all quotes from the 3 parts of the report, strange religious speculations, profitless inquiries which tend little to Christian improvement, and false doctrine. By contrast, also like Grant, the commissioners saw their own brand of religion as bringing light where there had previously been darkness. As Grant wrote, the true cure of darkness is the introduction of light. We ought to impart our superior light through English education, by which the people would rise in the scale of human beings, using the language and the light of Europe. And similarly, this is a quotation from the Report on Education in Wales, belief in charms, supernatural appearances, and even in witchcraft sturdily survive the civilization and light which has long ago banished those remnants of the dark ages elsewhere. Little or none of such light has as yet penetrated the dense darkness which, harboured by their language and undisturbed by availing efforts of enlightenment, enshrouds the minds of the people. Effective teaching of the English language was therefore seen as vital, both as a medium for the truths of Anglican doctrines and practice, and also as the medium for the civilizing power of English language and literature, and was a similar attitude is expressed in Macaulay's Minute of 1835. English stands preeminent even among the languages of the West, in contrast to the emphasizing, therefore, the importance of teaching English, whereas the commissioners were more concerned with describing the disadvantages of Welsh. The Welsh language is a vast drawback to Wales. It dissevers the people from intercourse, which would help advance their civilization, and bars the access of improving literature to the mind. As proof of this, there is no Welsh literature worthy of the name. And in the same way that Charles Grant regarded Indians without a knowledge of English as inferior to English speakers, so the commissioners saw the Welsh as doomed to permanent inferiority by their language. And the mission of English, the mission of the English authorities was therefore very clear, both in India and in Wales. Grant, we ought to impart our superior light through English education, by which the people of India would rise in the scale of human beings using the language and light of Europe, whereas the commissioners, again, were focusing on what they perceived as the disadvantages of Welsh. The Welsh language is particularly evasive, which originates from its having been the language of slavery. It keeps the Welshman under the hatches, while all the world about him is English. He's left to live in an underworld of his own, and the march of society goes completely over his head. Now, I certainly don't want to push the parallels too far. I'm aware I've only just started to scratch the surface of a fascinating subject. And of course, the whole colonial apparatus was far more developed in India than Wales, and attitudes of British officials in India to the millions whom we govern, in Macaulay's words, exhibit a degree of racism which is not usually found in the attitudes of English officials to the Welsh. I would suggest, however, that both the people of India and the Welsh working classes were regarded, it's tempting to quote Kipling here, as the lesser breeds without the law, and that what particularly surprised and enraged many English officials and observers, certainly the commissioners who wrote the report, was the fact that many of the Welsh people did not take advantage of living next door to the English in order to copy them, but they obstinately persisted in maintaining their own language, culture, and varieties of religion. From one point of view, the people of India had at least the excuse that they lived thousands of miles from the home of what English officials felt should have been their English role models. But to English authorities, the deliberate refusal of many Welsh people to follow those English role models was not only incomprehensible, but downright insulting. And both those attitudes are reflected very strongly in the 1847 report. Thanks.